The first generation 3-liter TDI is in my opinion one of the best diesel engines ever made. It has acceptable power output, good fuel consumption, and it can easily reach 500,000 kilometers or even more. Numerous times even more than 700,000 kilometers. You can find this engine in many different cars, ranging from a 3rd and 4th generation Audi A4 through a 1st generation A8 to the 1st and 2nd generation VW Touareg or Porsche Cayenne. Despite the fact that it can reach decent mileage, it can have numerous, more or less serious issues. But before I start with the list, I have to clarify that there are two versions of this engine, an older and a slightly updated newer. The older version is the simplest. It has a simple cooling and EGR system, and it was available in cars made mostly to 2007, mostly since the A8, for example, was available with this engine until the end of its production. The slightly newer version is roughly the same, but it has newer fuel injection parts and an updated EGR and cooling system. It was available from the end of 2007 in 3 power variants, plus it has a metallic intake manifold, which is the most noticeable visual difference from the oldest version. Issues with the variable intake manifolds are inevitable, mostly just the actuator motors fail, but the flap mechanism can be stuck or loose as well. Luckily there are cheap flap mechanism repair kits, and the aftermarket actuators are not that expensive either. The injectors themselves can get faulty after approximately 200,000 kilometers, and the injector washers can start to leak, but I will come back to these topics at the end of the video. The high pressure fuel pump in the oldest engine is a Bosch CP1, which can last forever, basically, without major issues. But in the newer version there is a newer Bosch CP4 pump, which will mechanically fail at some point, releasing tiny metal particles which will destroy all the injectors. Nobody knows when exactly it fails, since it can rarely fail before 200,000 kilometers, but usually just after this mileage point or just after 400,000 kilometers. However, using good quality fuel, eventually good fuel additives, will prolong the lifetime of this pump. The turbocharger mounted on top of the engine will fail at some point, but mostly just in higher mileage cars. The crankshaft pulley at the front will fall apart sooner or later, causing the accessory belt to jump off. In this case the alternator, water pump, power steering pump and AC compressor are gonna stop working. So if the pulley looks worn or if it's rusty, then it's better to replace it preventively. Next there are the oil and coolant leaks, which are inevitable. You can expect oil leaks from the valve cover gaskets, upper injector seals and rear main seal. But oil leaks between the cylinder heads are gonna appear too, specifically from the seals of the oil filter housing and from the seals of the oil cooler. Plus the various covers like the timing chain covers at the back or the front crankshaft cover, which are sealed with sealant from the factory, are gonna eventually slowly leak oil. The common coolant leaks are related to the specific EGR cooler O-rings located between the cylinder heads. In this case the coolant accumulates in this area between the cylinder heads. The thin plastic pipe on top of the engine is gonna sooner or later crack and leak coolant, so it's good to replace it even preventively since it's cheap. In this case again, the coolant accumulates between the cylinder heads. The rubber coolant hoses on the rear right side of the engine are not gonna last a very long time. Because of the close proximity of the exhaust manifold, they are exposed to bigger heat, which is gonna destroy them over time. The thermostat housing and the water pump are gonna leak coolant as well, but that's nothing special. And lastly, I have to mention that the newer version of this engine has an additional small thermostat connected to the EGR cooler. This thermostat can occasionally leak coolant as well because of the O-ring on it, but more often it simply fails, causing the engine coolant to not reach operating temperature. So if you already replaced the main thermostat and you still have issues with the coolant temperature, then most probably this small EGR thermostat is faulty. These engines are equipped with a pretty complex timing chain mechanism, but despite its complexity, it is possible that it will withstand even 500,000 kilometers. However, this is not a rule of thumb, and that's why after 300,000 kilometers, it's a good idea to replace the chain mechanism preventively. Or if you hear a louder, longer, rattling noise from the engine at startup, like this. Because remember that the tensioners and the plastic guides are gonna be worn to some extent, plus on high mileage cars the chains will stretch as well. On the other side, the timing chain failures on these engines causing catastrophic damage are not common. But if you hear a longer chain rattle, then yes, there is a chance that the chain jumps and causes engine damage. To end this list, there are a couple of last things related to these engines. So, don't forget to occasionally replace the high-pressure fuel pump belt and tensioner. This is often a neglected maintenance item, which is easy and cheap to replace. Occasionally various sensor failures can occur. Occasionally issues with the EGR valve or with the throttle body actuator can occur too. And lastly, it's good to know that the newer engines made from 2009 have a variable oil pump with 2 pressure stages regulated by this pressure regulating valve. This valve is located on the front lower part of the engine, so it's easy to see and access it. It can sometimes fail, so it's a good idea to replace this valve even preventively after 200,000 kilometers, because it's not that expensive. Before I move on to the last topics, I have to mention that mainly in the heavy SUVs, these engines are a bit more prone to leaking head gasket or cracked cylinder head. So pay attention to the various early and late signs of these issues. And before buying, check mainly the coolant. It has to be clean, topped up, without any oil traces or oil smell. However, I have to add that this is not a very common problem, so there is no need to panic. But try to not abuse these engines. To end this video, I will briefly talk about the injectors, DPF filter and a mysterious coolant loss, since all of these things are related to all these diesel engines. First, the injectors. The injectors will usually last at least approximately 200,000 kilometers, and in many cases even more than this, so they can somehow work even at 300,000 kilometers or 400,000 kilometers. However, be ready that they can fail after the already mentioned 200,000 kilometers. So at this mileage point it's good to at least remove them and have them tested. But if you want to be on the safe side, then you can also preventively replace all of them. The most common symptoms of badly working injectors are smoke from the exhaust at idle or during acceleration, slightly fluctuating idle, not good engine start, mainly with a warmed up engine, slightly higher fuel consumption will appear too, plus in this case the engine oil level can raise as well. But other symptoms can appear too, like a flashing glow plug light, check engine light, limp mode, injector related fault codes, and even a louder ticking, knocking noise from the faulty injectors. If you ignore any of these symptoms, then you are risking a major engine damage, which includes cracked or melted pistons and damaged cylinder walls. By the way, rarely the injectors can suddenly fail and start to leak excessive amount of fuel into the cylinder as well. This relatively rare phenomenon can easily end with a cracked or melted piston, which will damage the cylinder wall as well. To prolong the lifetime of the injectors, use good quality fuel, eventually good fuel additives, and replace the fuel filter regularly. Apart from the faulty injectors, you can experience leaking injector washers as well, but this issue can be easily and cheaply fixed. The symptoms of leaking injector washers are regular louder or not that loud hissing type noises from the engine, mostly at idle. exhaust smell in the interior and in the engine compartment will appear as well. And if the leak is bigger, then you will also notice a black tar-like substance coming out from the injector vent holes on the cylinder heads above the exhaust manifolds. The black tar can end up on the exhaust manifolds or on the engine mount brackets, so it's easy to spot this. Next, there is the DPF. Most of these engines are equipped with a DPF filter. It can last even 500,000 kilometers, but bad injectors, incorrect engine oil and using the car mainly on short distances are gonna reduce the lifetime of this filter significantly, since it gets clogged or even destroyed. By the way, if you are gonna use the car mainly for short distances, then the DPF will not burn off correctly. The result of this will be a rising oil level and later a clogged DPF. Some of the newer cars are equipped with the additional AdBlue emission system, which will have additional issues mainly in the older or high mileage cars, but I'm not gonna investigate this any further since nobody is paying me. Lastly, there is the mysterious coolant loss. All of these engines can rarely experience a mysterious coolant loss. If there is no external leak and the head gasket is fine together with the cylinder head, then this coolant loss is most probably caused by the EGR cooler, because rarely the EGR cooler can slightly crack internally, thus allowing the coolant to mix with the carbon soot in the cooler itself. Plus, it will slowly leak into the combustion chamber. This internal coolant leak is obviously not gonna help to extend the lifetime of the DPF filter, for example, so check the coolant level regularly and keep this in mind.